For decades, the world believed that the Berlin crisis of 1961 was a diplomatic standoff, a tense chess game played behind polished doors, while ordinary people watched from opposite sides of a concrete wall. What was hidden was not merely a disagreement over checkpoints, but an entire contingency plan, an order to turn the Cold War hot, that lay dormant in Soviet war rooms and NATO command bunkers alike. It benefited the architects of the bipolar system, Washington, Moscow, and the militaries that profited from perpetual readiness, because a controlled flashpoint promised them leverage without risking total annihilation. The truth matters today because every modern crisis still rides on the same invisible scaffolding of secret war plans that could be activated at a moment's notice. The escalation was not the act of one rogue general or an impulsive politician. It was a system, a doctrine of flexible response in the West, and escalation dominance in the East that normalized the idea that conventional war could be waged safely as long as nuclear weapons remained locked away. On October 27, 1961, Soviet troops stormed Checkpoint Charlie, their rifles spitting fire at U.S. soldiers stationed to guard the fragile passage. The shot echoed through a city already split by concrete, and it was the spark that ignited the first full-scale conventional clash between NATO and the Warsaw Pact on European soil. What no one knew at the time, what would not surface for decades, was that this encounter was merely the opening move of a larger, pre-planned campaign to test the limits of a war fought without nuclear fire. The Berlin Wall's construction began on August 13, 1961, an abrupt severing of families and commerce that signaled the Soviet Union's determination to seal its eastern flank. In the West, President John F. Kennedy had taken office just months earlier, on January 20, 1961, promising a new frontier of resolve against communist expansion. NATO, still under the integrated command of Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Lauris Norstad, had recently incorporated West Germany as a full member in May 1955, while East Germany entered the Warsaw Pact that same year, cementing the continent's division. Both alliances maintained massive conventional forces along the inner German border, armored divisions poised for rapid thrusts, artillery batteries trained on each other's positions, and air wings ready to scramble at a moment's notice. The United Nations, founded in 1945, continued its peacekeeping missions throughout the 1950s, but its influence over Europe had waned as superpowers filled the vacuum with their own security architectures. Behind the scenes, secret joint exercises, NATO's Operation Northern Light, and the Warsaw Pact's Exercise Red Star tested logistics for a continental war. Intelligence agencies on both sides monitored each other's troop movements obsessively, yet a mutual understanding persisted. As long as nuclear arsenals remained untouched, a conventional war could be fought without triggering mutually assured destruction. This paradox would become the crucible in which Europe's fate was forged. When Soviet soldiers opened fire on the U.S. checkpoint guards, the skirmish quickly escalated beyond a single exchange of bullets. Within hours, both sides mobilized reserve units. NATO's armored corps from West Germany surged forward, while Warsaw Pact tank divisions crossed into East German territory under the cover of darkness. The United Nations attempted an emergency diplomatic session, but the rapid tempo of events left little room for mediation. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Streets of Berlin turned into battlefields, with civilian casualties mounting as artillery shells fell on neighborhoods that had known only division, not destruction. NATO's Air Force launched a series of interdiction missions to cripple Soviet supply lines, while Soviet MiG-19s contested the skies, forcing US F-86 Sabres into fierce dogfights over the outskirts of the city. What would become clear in the weeks that followed was that this conflict was not an isolated incident, but the first phase of a coordinated plan to test Europe's capacity for sustained conventional warfare. The question loomed, could either side achieve a decisive breakthrough without crossing the nuclear threshold? The answer would shape the continent's destiny. By early November, fighting had spilled beyond Berlin. In the Ruhr industrial heartland of West Germany, NATO engineers erected makeshift fortifications, while Soviet artillery pounded factories that once symbolized German economic resurgence. East German Volkssturm units, bolstered by Soviet infantry, pushed westward, seeking to seize key rail hubs and oil depots. The United States, as the primary NATO combat force, committed additional divisions from the 1st Infantry Division and airborne brigades to reinforce vulnerable sectors. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union dispatched elite forces from the 2nd Guards Tank Army, aiming to break through the Fulda Gap, a corridor long identified by Western strategists as a potential invasion route. Amid the grinding attrition, civilian infrastructure crumbled. Power stations were targeted, leaving millions without electricity. Water treatment plants were sabotaged, creating humanitarian crises that strained both sides' logistical chains. The war had become a test of endurance as much as tactics, and each side grappled with the moral weight of fighting on German soil, a nation already scarred by 2 world wars. The conventional conflict in Europe sent shockwaves around the globe. In Cuba, Fidel Castro watched the European battle with a mixture of admiration and apprehension, aware that any escalation could draw his island into the fray. By October 1962, just as the real-world Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, Soviet leaders faced a dilemma. Had they already demonstrated enough conventional strength to deter further Western aggression, or did the crisis in Berlin demand an additional show of force in the Caribbean? In Asia, the Korean armistice of 1953 remained a fragile ceasefire. North Korean commanders, emboldened by Soviet successes, began covertly reinforcing their border with China, fearing that NATO's focus on Europe might leave them vulnerable to renewed hostilities. The United Nations peacekeeping missions, already stretched thin from earlier Cold War deployments, struggled to maintain stability in volatile regions as resources were diverted to the European theater. The war also strained NATO's internal cohesion. France, still wary of American dominance after its 1958 establishment of an independent nuclear deterrent, questioned whether continued participation would serve its national interests. The alliance faced a pivotal test. Could it hold together under the pressure of a protracted conventional conflict without resorting to nuclear escalation? By December 1961, both sides recognized that a decisive breakthrough was essential. NATO's planners identified the Fulda Gap as the most viable corridor for a Soviet thrust into the heart of West Germany. Conversely, Soviet strategists saw it as an opportunity to split Western forces and force a political settlement. The battle that unfolded there became the war's defining moment. Soviet armored divisions launched a massive night assault, supported by artillery barrages that rattled the earth for miles. NATO defenders, entrenched on high ground, utilized anti-tank guided missiles, still in their infancy but effective enough to halt several spearheads. The fighting was ferocious. Tank crews fought at point-blank range, and infantry units engaged in brutal house-to-house combat within ruined villages. Amid the carnage, a crucial decision was made by General Norstad. He ordered a limited tactical nuclear strike on a forward Soviet supply depot, hoping to blunt the offensive without igniting full-scale nuclear war. The detonation, low-yield and precisely targeted, created a blinding flash that halted the Soviet advance but also shattered the long-standing taboo against any nuclear use in Europe. The consequences were immediate and profound. The Soviet command, shocked by the breach of the unwritten rule, hesitated, while NATO forces rallied around the unexpected show of resolve. Yet the world now stood on a precipice. Had this single tactical strike opened the door to wider nuclear exchange? The answer would dictate the war's final act. The tactical nuclear blast forced both superpowers back to the negotiating table. Behind closed doors in Geneva, diplomats from Washington, Moscow, and the United Nations convened under intense pressure from their respective populations who were exhausted by months of artillery fire, bombing raids, and dwindling supplies. The resulting agreement, known later as the Berlin Armistice of 1962, established a demilitarized zone stretching across central Germany, prohibited further use of nuclear weapons on European soil, and called for massive reconstruction aid funded jointly by NATO and Warsaw Pact nations. It also mandated the creation of an international monitoring commission to oversee compliance, a precursor to later arms control treaties. The ceasefire did not erase the scars. Entire cities lay in ruins. The Ruhr's industrial capacity was reduced to ash, forcing Europe into a prolonged economic recovery that would take decades. Politically, the war reshaped alliances. France rejoined NATO under new terms granting it greater autonomy, while West Germany emerged with a renewed sense of national identity forged through sacrifice. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, the decision by both superpowers to permanently ban nuclear weapons on the continent, a pact born from terror and necessity. This commitment would become the cornerstone of a fragile peace that endured throughout the remainder of the Cold War. The conventional war sparked by the October 27, 1961, shooting at Checkpoint Charlie remains a stark reminder of how close humanity once stood to a different kind of apocalypse. The hidden contingency plans that lay dormant in both NATO and Warsaw Pact archives finally surfaced, exposing a system that had long accepted the notion of controlled hot conflict as an acceptable risk. Europe's landscape was forever altered, cities rebuilt brick by brick, societies reshaped by loss, and generations taught to question the legitimacy of any war fought under the veil of secrecy. The world learned that even without nuclear detonations across continents, industrial warfare could scar a continent for centuries, eroding economies, cultures, and trust. Today, as new tensions rise and old alliances are tested, the lessons of that divergent timeline echo louder than ever. The structures that once normalized the idea of a limited conventional war still exist in defense doctrines, intelligence assessments, and political rhetoric. Understanding how those mechanisms operated and how they were finally halted offers a blueprint for preventing another descent into chaos. The story of the Berlin crisis turned hot is not merely an alternate history, it is a cautionary tale etched into the very fabric of our collective memory. It urges us to look beyond the surface of diplomatic statements, to question the hidden frameworks that guide decisions of war and peace, and to remember that the line between a controlled conflict and total catastrophe can be thinner than a single rifle shot.